Good morning and welcome to Sunday Coffee, Art, Design, and Architecture, and a happy Sunday morning to you. This show is coming to you from Florida on a gorgeous Sunday morning overlooking the gentle lapping waves on the Gulf of Mexico. My motivation for this podcast channel is to broadcast good news stories, interesting people, and food for thought. So pour yourself a nice hot cup of tea or coffee, take a deep breath, get cozy, and enjoy a break for some uplifting conversations. And today's book is Exercises in Architecture: Learning to Think Like an Architect, second edition, by Simon Unwin, published by Routledge in 2223. Simon is an emeritus professor of architecture at the University of Dundee, Scotland. He has lived, worked, and taught in and around Great Britain, Australia, China, Israel, India, Turkey, and the US. So, hi, Simon. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tricia. Thank you for inviting me to have a conversation with you this morning.
Well, across the pond, this is pretty nice. I've got a cup of green tea with a spot of honey. What are you having this morning?
I'm having a cup of coffee, and it's a lovely day in Cardiff.
In Cardiff, and let's tell everybody, it's in Wales.
That's right, it's in Wales. Some people think it's in England, but the Welsh are very proud of their nation and insist that Cardiff is in Wales.
Well, duly noted. We're talking from Florida to Wales this morning on a beautiful Sunday and day there. So Simon, let's start with, can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and your educational background?
Righto, I'm Simon Unwin. As you say, I'm the an emeritus professor of architecture in Dundee University. But I spent most of my career teaching in the Welsh School of Architecture here in Cardiff. In the beginning of my own education as an architect, I found learning to do architecture very, very, very difficult. So I think I've spent most of the rest of my career, if not all the rest of my career, which is now some 50 years, trying to understand why, trying to understand the workings of architecture and how the architectural mind operates. That's resulted in something like 10 books. I've written all of them primarily for students of architecture. They're intended to help them to get over that hurdle of beginning to learn how to do architecture. And as the subtitle of the book that we're talking about this morning says, learning to think as an architect.
Well, that's interesting. Just a little background. My psychology degree really focused on learning because I was actually a dolphin trainer, and all the dolphin trainers major in psychology and learning. So I was particularly interested in that. So let me ask you, what did you find difficult about learning to be an architect, and how did you start? How do you think like an architect?
That's a big question, Tricia. Um, but I'll tell you that the way I think about it is that if you go back to primary and secondary school, can't remember what you call them in the US, high school, the vast majority of our learning is conducted through primarily two media, which we might describe as being language, exploring the world through the medium of words, and mathematics, exploring the world through numbers. But when I began to think about why I had had problems, because I became a teacher, despite having problems, I went more or less seamlessly from, I did go out into practice for a while, but not only for a few years. And then I was back teaching architecture. So as a teacher, I wanted to help my students not suffer the sort of difficulties that I'd been through as an early years architecture student myself. So I naturally started to think about why it seemed so difficult to me. And I realized that it might be because architecture operates in a language which is fundamentally different from either of those that I mentioned a minute or so ago. It's not a language of words, and it's not a language of mathematics. It's a language of something else. And I describe it now as being a language of organizing space into places. That's about as simple a way as I can put it. But it's the reason why in one of my other books is called Analyzing Architecture, and it came out just about a year or so ago in its fifth edition. The first edition was 1997. But when I was preparing the fifth edition, actually a correspondent, because I do, and I'm very grateful for people writing to me with ideas about the books that I write. And I had a lovely email from somebody who said that really was enjoying all the books that I'd written, but wondered whether Analyzing Architecture needed a subtitle to clarify something about what it's about. So for its fifth edition, I added a subtitle, which was The Universal Language of Placemaking. Now, I think, if I'm right, Tricia, that you have some background in landscape architecture. Does that description of, I think of the universal language of placemaking as not just encompassing the architecture of buildings, but the architecture of landscapes too?
Yes, and I've never been asked a question before.
Well, that's the Brits for you, Tricia.
Okay, my turn. Yes, I can relate. I got my master's degree in landscape architecture, and I felt like a bit lost almost at the end of the program because I've done so many things. I've been a photographer, so I know a little bit about design and composition. I didn't feel like we covered it. I hate to say that. But I felt really lost and challenged too, and I felt I know there's something else that I'm supposed to be doing. Even if it's outside the building, we're arranging spaces, and I like that about your book, arranging spaces and materials and voids, and how do we do this to best, um, make a place that's comfortable and beautiful? I know that there's not the only way to do it, or there's many different ways, but there has to be some good principles for really how to do it well.
I agree.
And I think everybody can walk through a space and go, "Yeah, like, this is really not functional. This is really not good." And then go through another one and go, "Yeah, this is really good. This feels really good." And yeah, I guess my question was, what is the language? I always loved geometry, and I felt like that's kind of geometry, is space and voids and lines and
Yes, that's right. Geometry is a very important aspect of it. But on the point of making places for the things that we do, as you probably know, we're recording this during a week of mourning for the Queen in Britain. And I don't know whether you're getting the coverage in the United States. You're probably getting some of the coverage. But in my professional capacity, I mean, we're all sad at losing our Queen. But in my professional capacity, it's an opportunity for me to reinforce my understanding of the ways in which architecture frames ceremonial and pageantry and important events like funerals and processions. For example, a few days ago, there was the procession or the cortege taking the Queen's coffin from Holyrood Palace up to St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. And yes, of course, the appearance of those stone buildings along the Royal Mile in Edinburgh are part of the atmosphere and the character. But it's also just the fact of that extraordinarily powerful pathway that goes from the seat of royal power up to the seat of military power in Edinburgh, the castle at the top of the hill, passing St Giles Cathedral on the way. And then when they took the coffin into the cathedral itself, the bearers taking the coffin, putting it at the geometric center of the church on a catafalque, and then realize the whole event being framed by the cathedral. I think these are very powerful examples of the universal language of placemaking and the way that we live our life in places. Getting students to think in those sorts of ways, because I think there's a sort of first thought about what designing architecture is about is designing what buildings look like. And the media often discuss architecture in terms of what it looks like. But I think far more powerful is the way that architecture works in making places, framing. That word framing I find extraordinarily powerful. I remember having dinner with some quite eminent architectural theorists, and we were discussing what's wrong with architecture. And I commented that I thought that architecture was a frame trying to be the subject of the viewpoint. And so often architects are trying to make things that are going to look good in photographs, i.e., within a frame of a photograph. But when you think about that royal funeral, the church becomes the frame of the event. So I hope that gives you some idea of the underlying ways in which I think about the way that architects think.
Yes, and as you said that, I was thinking of I there is coverage over here. We have a fascination with the Royals, and they have it on YouTube, etcetera.
Mhm.
So, but I was looking at it too, like you were saying, like placemaking outside, and I saw an overall map. I got a better idea of Windsor. It's like that long road, straight road up to I think it's the castle or
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
and how powerful how landscape architecture just goes into architecture
Mm.
and the space that they create outside for because they do a lot of outside processional military viewing and how big is it how's it going to work and what does it say about how what does landscape say about the building.
Well, how they interrelate with each other. Yes, that is very much so. That's another aspect of the way that I used to start teaching students, because I think during my career I was studio tutor in just about every year. We have 5 years in a school of architecture here in the UK, but probably the most interesting one. I spent a number of years being the studio tutor in first year. And of course, that's where you're coming up against this hurdle of how you get into learning to think as an architect. And so we're blessed in South Wales, where Cardiff is, with some beautiful beaches. Maybe they're not as beautiful as Florida beaches, but we're quite fond of our beaches. And so I would get all the students into a big bus and we'd go down to a beach early in the morning and I'd give them the instruction to make a place. It was always an interesting day. They'd be struggling with what does Simon mean? Make a place, and some of them would make sand sculptures, which is not really the same as making a place. But some of the best examples were really good, and the students later would say to me that that was when the penny dropped, because I would also say to them that you've always been an architect since you were a child, since you were making dens under tables, or you were making circles in the sand, or encampments as a Boy Scout or a Girl Guide. You were making places that you might spend the night or spend the day by the sea. And so what you need to do to begin to think as an architect is to reawaken that latent architect that's already in you. That's another way in which I think that formal education that's focused on learning through words and through number tends to push that other natural skill that we have, which is thinking in terms of placemaking. It makes it subconscious, or makes it latent, pushes it down, because our conscious minds are getting more and more geared to thinking in terms of words and in terms of numbers. And therefore, beginning architectural education, I think, is about reawakening that initial human capacity for framing the things that they do in their lives. And you think back through all of history into prehistory, whether it's to do with making stone circles or chamber tombs, that's what people were doing. They were making places where they might have ceremonials or where their important people would be buried when they died. They would have been making domestic places, fireplaces that they would sit around, places to cook, places to sleep. We've always spoken the universal language of placemaking. And as with any language, it's not quite the same as if I speak English, I'm learning French, because then I've got my own language as a reference point. But as a child, I learned English from my parents and from interrelating with my environment with other people. And learning architecture is a bit like that, because there isn't a reference. You've got to reawaken that inner capacity by which you can become somebody who can make places not just for yourself, but as wanting to be a professional, that you are so fluent in this language that people will employ you to make places for them. And that aspect, the book that we're talking about is divided into three main parts. There's a fourth supplement, which I've added in this second edition. But the first part is about fundamentals, and that's about, generally speaking, is using building blocks to experiment with the way in which space can be organized into places. The second section of the book is about, well, you've used the word geometry. It's about the different ways in which we use geometry. And that's from the sort of geometries that are intrinsic to the way we relate to each other, the geometry of conversation, the geometry of sitting in a circle, the geometry of eating a meal, the geometry of having a meeting, a geometry of standing up and giving a lecture to students, those sort of geometries of being. And then the more, what I call ideal geometry, which is the sort of geometry that you learn in school mathematics lessons, which is about squares and circles and golden rectangles and things like that. And all those, obviously, the geometries of being are very important in architecture, because you are framing meetings and lectures and church services and parliamentary debates and all these different things that architecture frames almost always have some element of the geometry of being in them. So as an architect, you have to understand those things. But then you also get architects who they have a certain sort of mind that likes things to be neat and precise, and like to use geometric figures like squares and circles in a perfect way to give their work some sort of geometric authority. So those are the two first parts. But the third part, and I've had some positive feedback on this because it was the same in the first edition of the book, is titled Out into the Real World. And that is like an extended version of the project that I used to set those first year students by taking them down to the beach and telling them to make a place. And it insists, it says so much of architecture in schools of architecture is, well, in my day, was conducted by with a pencil on a piece of paper on a drawing board with parallel motion. And it's so much now is conducted on the other side of a computer screen with a mouse or a graphics tablet, or using software or things like SketchUp to make three-dimensional models the other side of the screen. I've tried to underline the importance for students as they develop their fluency in this universal language of placemaking. It's essential, and schools of architecture expect students to become fluent in using computer software, but not to confine oneself to that, but to get out into the sunshine, get out into the world, get out into the rain even and the wind, and make places out there in the real world. I think that is so important, and it was interesting. My wife and I went to Greece was just before the pandemic. So this would be 2019, I think. And we were in southern Greece, staying in a lovely family hotel. And I was walking back from the swimming pool, looking a bit bedraggled, and I heard this voice in the distance shouting, "Simon! Simon!" And I turned round, and it was one of my ex-students from probably 10 years, maybe 15 years earlier. And he had his family with him. And so he invited my wife and I to come and sit with him. And one of the first things he said was, "I always remember that project you made us do on the beach in South Wales." And my wife still comments on it, that sort of insistence that they go and make a place out in the real world sticks in students' minds, even decades later.
I think it's almost instinctual. I loved, of course, that's the first on page 5 for everybody. That's the first exercise, and of course, I
Mm.
live here at the beach, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah. Yeah, just we go down to the beach, and what do people do? You set down your towel, your umbrella, you set up this, you set up that, and if you look everywhere on the beach, everybody's got their own little, quote, place."
Yes, that's right.
And I was thinking too, that's the experience I had growing up, is that me and my brother, it was open woods here and we could just run through it and we would just make forts. And I was thinking about the kids even in my class. I'm like, "Didn't you go through the woods and make forts?" And they're like, "No." And I'm like, "Boy, you really missed out on
Well, I agree.
something."
Mm.
And I remember my friend's child, she was making her own little fort. You were talking about that in the living room. And she's like building her own fort. Do you think it's instinctual for us to build shelter? Or is it something we see and learn? Or, I mean, that is the first place architecture we do just as
Yeah,
little tiny babies.
that's right. Spot on. You put your finger on it. And that's so important, I think, and it's one of the things behind this book is that to reinforce that idea of allowing your mind to recall those sorts of things. Yeah, we call them dens over here, but I realize you call them forts over there, don't you? When children make places in the woods, you make forts. And it's so important. Even things you experience things like being outside of the fort and being inside of the fort, and you take those sort of things for granted, but they're very powerful. The way that architecture includes and excludes, and it's amazing how many cultures around the world put importance on the threshold. I've even got a book here in my study, which it's called the Threshold Covenant, and it's a collection, and it's not a thin book, of hundreds of examples from cultures around the world about the way that those cultures place importance on the threshold, the place that's neither inside nor outside, and how powerful those can be. If you go around European, I may well. Oh, the stoop in America is an example of the place that's neither outside nor inside, but is a sort of threshold between the inside and the outside, the porch. And how, if you go around traditional European villages whether in Greece or in Italy or Spain or wherever, often the most pleasant in terms of atmosphere because you're probably shaded, but pleasant in a social sense as well because you might be able to have a chat with people going by. Most pleasant place in so many dimensions to sit is on the threshold by the doorway. And of course, there are practical aspects to it as well, because if the phone rings, you can pop back inside to answer the phone, or all those dimensions. So learning to think as an architect is making yourself consciously aware of those, parts, those elements of this language of architecture, um, so that you can use them more carefully and poetically yourself when you're designing buildings.
Yes, and I know we're reiterating the point, but I was thinking about this. A friend of mine pointed out I play flute, and she said,
Uh-huh.
music is a foreign language. And I'm like, it's like learning a foreign language. I'm like, yeah, it's true. It is a foreign language. Not everybody can speak it, but you have to learn it.
Yeah.
And architecture is another kind of another foreign language to learn. So it's something you got to learn all the words and well, not just words, and then how to do it in a right brain language.
Uh-huh. I have never made up my mind about that. I read drawing on the right hand side of the brain a long time ago, and I'm pretty convinced that drawing is the right brain language. But I haven't come to a conclusion. It's actually I haven't really considered whether I think that architecture is a right brain thing or I think it might be a whole brain thing.
I think it's a whole brain thing.
But
Well, let me ask you. Okay, so you have that's what I want to talk about. You've got lots of really like super good practical stuff in here.
kind of you to say so.
And I appreciate that it's not I mean, you got your theory. Got to have a little theory. Let's start with the fundamentals. What's the first fundamental thing that the beginning studio architecture, besides after they go to the beach, what is the next step in the process? What's a good exercise for them to focus on?
Well, I suppose in the book, the first thing I try to address in the fundamentals is realizing what an idea might be in architecture. I think if you are thinking in terms of language, you realize that sentence expresses an idea. That's and without an idea, there's no point in having a sentence. It's just nonsense. In mathematics, in an equation, you have an idea. The idea is, this and this equals this in its simplest form. I'm not a very sophisticated mathematician, but so the first thing in the book, in the fundamentals, is trying to give some idea of what an idea in architecture is, and that I use these children's blocks, and take people back to how they were as a child when their parents gave them a pile of simple blocks to build towers with, and just make the point that that tower that you built when you were a child is, it may not be an original architectural idea, but it is an architectural idea. And to make you aware of just how powerful um, an expression of the agency of the mind that tower actually is. That's rather sort of highfalutin language for something that is very simple and direct. But the difference between a random pile of blocks as they're thrown out of the box and a tower, the essential difference is the idea that creates the tower, and how uh, all architecture depends on ideas. Um, Even if you decide that your idea is to create chaos, it's still an idea. It's not necessary that it's always ordered and simple, but whatever you do as an architect is going to depend on ideas. So the fundamentals begins with that, but then it goes on to the ways in which, and I try to bring in, because I don't just use children's blocks, I use those little artist mannequins as well, because I think maybe I'm probably being unfair to a lot of my colleagues in architecture, but sometimes I am aware that architects forget that what they're doing is actually for people. And so, as early as I can within the book, I bring in the artist mannequins in relation to the building blocks as being the representation of the presence of people, first as an individual, and talk about things like being inside and being outside or being on the threshold. but then introduce the geometries of social interaction by having a group of these artist mannequins and showing how architecture frames their relationships, whether in a domestic environment or maybe in a simple chapel-like environment, and how people might relate to the idea of an axis, which doorway. I see the doorway as being not just the threshold, but the primary generator of an axis. And when you think of any church in the world, or whether it, often religious buildings, whether they're Buddhist buildings or Islamic buildings, will build on this axis that is generated by a doorway. In a mosque, it's the doorway of the mihrab, which creates the axis which the worshippers relate to. In a Christian church, it's the axis of the doorway that relates to the altar, whether it's a central altar or an altar at the other end of the church, and people relate to that axis, even to the extent that within many churches and other religions, people, if they cross that axis, and remember, this is a relationship between a person and architecture, if they cross that axis, which they see as being religiously significant, their response is to stop and bow. That's, architecture and its effect on the way we behave and the way that the way that it frames all the things that we do is a very powerful medium. I'm not sure that's a strong enough word. This language is very powerful in the way that it frames just about everything that we do.
I was thinking too, for example, I built my own house and I was able to work with he was a draftsman and we had the layout. He goes, this is how you need to really lay it out. And we laid it out and we did, and I learned a lot from him. And most people, and I kept all my furniture to scale. I kept
Mm-hmm.
everything to scale to that house when I got that. And when people would walk in, I mean, it was only 1295 square feet, but people were like, wow, this must be like 1,500 square feet. I'm like, no. And it was amazing how simple things like the vaulted ceilings and gave it such a bigger feel than it really was, and how that affected people and how they felt more relaxed.
Yeah.
Um, and then when I was in apartment in grad school, I was aggravated every time because whoever designed that kitchen, the dishwasher would always open right here, and you couldn't walk around the island. It blocked the whole.
Yes.
And I'm like, who designed this?
Oh, we used to. Have you done any tuition in schools of architecture or schools of landscape architecture? Because that's one of the great funs. I mean, I miss it now. I don't do it so often now that I'm retired. But the often conversations with students when they'd have their work up in front of the jury would be around things just like that. Sometimes you'd have students who put a plan up that had no door in it into a room, and they just say helplessly, "I forgot to put the door in." They say, "Well, don't you think the position of the door, irrespective of the fact that you needed a door to get in and out, but the position of the door into a room can affect the character of that room in relation to windows or in relation to other things there might be a focus in that room, there might be a view out to the garden. How do you want your doorway to introduce that room in an experiential way to somebody in your house?" So often you were having discussions with students about things like the dishwasher door opening and stopping you getting around the kitchen island and things like that, the practicalities, but also the poetic possibilities of those seemingly practical issues too.
Well, I was thinking at my own personal property. Yeah, when you said that, I walked in and there was a window straight across, and it's kind of like two circular patterns that really float, and you could look that way out to the back part of the yard and that way towards that, and how it made it a very pleasant opening into my house.
Ah, it sounds lovely.
It was.
And,
And
and the beach and the view of the Gulf of Mexico. I'm very envious.
well, my house I didn't have enough money to be on the beach. I was off the beach in the woods, but it circled around and how it did that and thinking it's almost like when you're saying I was thinking about it's like we have to like rediscover what we already know in landscape architecture school or architecture school.
Yes, very much so. I very much agree with that. Yes, and become conscious of it in a way that you can develop it, collect ideas. I'm looking at a shelf in my study which has got tens of notebooks on it. Part of the process, I think, and within this book, Exercises in Architecture, I devote some pages to what a student might do in their notebook as they go along. And most of those are to do with collecting ideas from other architects, from their own experience as they go around the world, being conscious of little architectural episodes. Not that they necessarily need them to use them in the next project that they do, but just as we almost subliminally collect little ways of speaking or words or ways of expression as we're children that we might experiment with ourselves as we grow up. I see keeping a notebook as a very important part of learning to think as an architect. I still go back through my notebooks over the last 40, 50 years and still find things that remind me of, because they're a bit like diaries, but they're more notebooks and sketches and little diagrams of places that I've been. So there's a lot of encouragement in exercises in architecture for students to keep a notebook as well.
Do you kind of do that so you kind of feel the voids and spaces of places and how it works?
Very much so, yes, yes. I also collect quotations from novels that describe places. Actually, that's another exercise in the book, which is there's a fourth section. I mentioned the first three sections of it, and one of those is to take the description of a place from a novel or a song or a poem, whatever. And I used to run this with the students too, and design it. Um,
Hmm.
Design it from the description. If there's a description of a room or a courtyard or a garden, evoke it in your mind, in your imagination. But more than that, draw a plan of it. I would insist it being a plan and a section rather than a pictorial image, because those are the two ways in which architects tend to conceive their architecture. And so if you've got a description from Gabriel Garcia Marquez or from Charles Dickens or whoever, both of whom are very rich sources of descriptions of places, try to draw that South American courtyard that Marquez describes, with the plants and with the fountain, with the crows making a noise in the cages, and the sunlight and the shade from the trees. Try to design that place. You might even use it in a project. Use a quotation as being the starting point for a design. So in my notebooks, I collect descriptions of places. I collect bits of architects' theories, but if I was to betray a little bit of my own feelings, I think I would say that there's a lot of architectural theory that's expressed only in words. And I think really architectural theory should include some form of drawing, which is the medium through which I think architects do actually think.
Well, that kind of reminded me. I think it's almost we lost a little primal. It's like our first drawing an idea of like drawings in caves,
Uh huh.
like in
Yeah.
France. As
Yeah.
that was our first expression of this is an idea. I got a goat, and I need to draw a goat. I need to tell you this is a goat.
Oh, have you been to those caves in France?
I haven't, but I have read about them.
Oh, they're wonderful. You must make it over there sometime. Absolutely, very, very powerful. I think they were, some of those drawings are deep in caves where there's no light. They must have, taken half an hour or sometimes in the dark to get to the places where they drew the mammoths or the horses or whatever. And I think what they were doing was thinking that this is where those animals were born,
Hmm.
and that by taking the idea of those animals in graphic form and putting them on the walls of the cave, they would somehow stimulate their birth and come forth into the world, and then they could hunt them and they could feed themselves on those animals. But no, you should try and get over and see them sometime. They're very, very powerful.
Well, now that COVID's over, we can all make trips back to Europe again.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Well,
My wife and I are planning something now, but we haven't decided yet.
I love this quote, and I think, of course, this is going to appeal to me. You had it in your book, and so the readers, they're all going to buy your books. They can see these quotes too. Alfred Kilmer, I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. What you're saying, I was like, how would I design something? Now I'm going to have to go through and try. I'm going to trying your exercises here. Design that idea. Hmm.
Yes, that's a good challenge. If you do that design, perhaps you could email it to me, and I could see it then.
Oh, there we go. Yes, I can do that.
You weren't expecting that, were you, Tricia?
I'm turning into a student here.
No, I'd just be interested. It's
Yeah.
something I might use in a future book.
Oh, there you go. Well, I have one question. So now, well, I'll go back a little practical. What did you do in this second edition that you felt? Why did you feel it was important to write this second edition? What's different about it?
Partly it was to do with the format. The format of the first edition was a little bit clumsy. All the exercises from the first edition are in the second edition, but I've added quite a few others. I think the format is better. It's certainly more conducive to an e format, a digital format, than the previous edition. And I've also, as I say, I've added this extra section at the end, which has some additional exercises that don't fit into those first three categories. I also had some correspondence that said that the first edition, had been useful. You've mentioned that it might be useful in landscape studies or landscape architecture studies, but apparently it's been useful too in urban design studies. So I've tried to include a few extra exercises or observations or notebook exercises geared towards urban design studies too. The general argument of the book is the same as in the first edition, as you'd expect, but by reformatting it, I've managed to include quite a lot more exercises and gear them a little bit more towards other aspects of this broad business of doing architecture.
It's just principles apply to art principles throughout anything.
One thing I'd like to say is that the book is part of what I see as not so much a trilogy, but a group of three books that I put together. I've mentioned Analyzing Architecture, the Universal Language of Architecture, which the first edition came out in 1997, 25 years ago, and the fifth edition came out last year. I see that as being the foundation of this trilogy of books. The second one is called 25 Buildings That Every Architect Should Understand. And in that book, I've analysed some buildings which I've found of particular interest, some by Le Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright, others by less well-known architects, a very good architect in India called Lisa Raju Subhadra, and also other people. I've tried to find a wide variety of different approaches to architecture and analyze those individual buildings from their work using the theory that I put forward in the first book, Analysing Architecture. And then the third book in the trilogy is the Exercises in Architecture. And I see that as being a way of dealing with three aspects. You mentioned music earlier. In music, you have music theory and you have music composition. And as a music student, you would also analyze the work of other composers to understand the way in which they use the theory of music. But you'd also have exercises, whether as a composer or as a performer. You'd have exercises which are to do with the technique of playing an instrument, but as a composer, you'd have exercise is in maybe composing variations on a theme or all those sorts of things. So in my three books, Analysing Architecture, 25 Buildings Every Architect Should Understand, and Exercises in Architecture, I think I've dealt with those three aspects. The first one is very much about setting down the underlying theory of the workings of architecture. The second one presents these 25 case studies analysing some distinctive works of architecture in terms of that theory. And then in the third, setting down exercises that people who want to be architects can go through to develop their own fluency in the language and their own ability to think as architects. So that it's part of a three-part. I've put together lots of other books too, but I see these three books as being a sort of unified way of approaching teaching students to be architects.
Oh, yes, that sounds good. So you got like your whole all your studios together and
Yeah,
how to get there. Well, then
yeah,
I don't want to forget to mention everybody that but you have the notebook series. You got Metaphor, Shadow, Children, and Curve too. So you've got
that's
other
right.
tell us okay, go tell us a little bit about those just real quick.
They came out from a discussion with my publisher in the sense that analysing architecture has got to nearly 350 pages, and I thought that's probably already a little bit too big for a first year student to deal with. So I was trying to think of a way in which I could include, I had lots of other ideas for chapters, thematic chapters that might be included in that book. And so I came up with this idea of beginning a series of analysing architecture notebooks. And as you say, the first three were Metaphor, Curve, and Children as Placemakers. And subsequently, I did one on Shadow, the art of withholding light. And they gave me the opportunity to collect examples and theorize and write and draw about themes in architecture that I would have liked to have done as chapters in analyzing architecture. But the advantage of doing them as separate notebooks is that it meant that I had a lot more space to develop those ideas than I would have had if I only had 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 pages in analyzing architecture. So the advantage of that is that I've got, and I've also got, I gave my publisher 45 cards on which I came up with titles for the notebooks that I would like to do, and my publisher chose a few of them for me to get me started. And I said, well, I'll do all of them if you give me the medication to keep me alive long enough. So, so that's what I'm working on at the moment. I'll somehow we'll get a copy to you in when it's out. But I'm doing one on at the moment on the architecture of gardens, and that's not to do. I mean, if you say garden architecture to people, they think you mean gazebos and pavilions and things like that, buildings in gardens. I'm not excluding those, but what I'm more interested in is the conceptual organization of gardens. Often people think that gardens are just about the collection of plants that you've got, and the architecture of them can be quite simple. But I am interested in the way that you organize gardens in terms of routes, in terms of axes, in maybe in terms of geometry, in terms of light and shade, in terms of sound, even certainly in terms of perfume, in terms of control and letting go. That aspect which people seem to discuss these days. You might think of a French garden as being very controlled, or everything clipped and geometric, and an English garden as being more relaxed, letting things grow into their own shape. So those dimensions of control and relaxation, or allowing things to be themselves, comes into this notebook on the architecture of, of a garden. That there's only one architecture, but that there's lots of themes that you can develop, and it's another way of looking at this universal language of architecture.
Oh, no, when you said that, I was like, yeah, I'm a garden architect. Monet in Giovanni,
Uh-huh.
and talking about there was a really good film put out about him and talking about how he developed his gardens in there. And I'm like, he's a landscape architect.
And yeah, well, yes, but I think if I saw the same program that you're mentioning, the I think the person who was looking at it also said that, as well as him being a landscape architect, he was very conscious of designing the garden to make pictures, so that he was also being the painter, in that he thought, oh, that bridge is going to look good there, and those reflections look good there, and that the person who was analysing the garden was very aware that he was being a painter as well as a garden architect.
And I think that more than anything, I visited there before I
Mm.
went to landscape architecture school. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to,
Uh-huh.
that's
Yeah,
something about it. I was like, I don't know that special something about it. You walk around and everybody's just in awe.
yes, yeah. Oh, very powerful. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So are there other European gardens that you visited when you were in France?
Yes, I got to do my own little kind of like European tour, and I visited Scotland too,
Uh-huh.
and Dublin and London, and of course I've been to Paris many times, Austria. It's true. That I what you said about control versus loose, very much a very important quality in gardens, and how it makes you feel, and how it makes you, you know what, behave.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I felt a little more stiff upper lip here, and then I felt like, yeah, I can sit out here, just put my feet on the grass and just relax. And how it made you feel at the Tuileries versus
Yeah.
um, somewhere else. Uh,
Yeah.
that's very true. I think that it's just all architecture, isn't it?
Yeah. That's right. I mean, did you go to the Loire Valley? Did you go to any of the gardens of the Great Palais of the Villandry, or places like that? They're
No.
very formal gardens, they're those geometric gardens with neatly clipped hedges in complicated patterns.
I don't know. I have gone outside of Paris and just visited a few castles, within an hour or so.
Uh-huh.
And yes, it was all very topiary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Whereas the Germans call an untidy garden an English garden. I wonder why. Because we're an untidy lot, I presume.
I hadn't I have been through Germany, but I haven't
Mm.
been to the countries. I haven't been to their gardens enough to know. I don't know.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I'm teasing. I'm teasing.
It's okay. I was kinda thought I was like, I don't know. I haven't really looked at the German gardens actually yet.
Uh,
Well, Simon, oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate, you joining us, and my cup of tea is gone. Is your coffee about done?
it's all gone. Yes, yes. It's been very enjoyable talking to you, Tricia. When the garden notebook comes out, maybe we can do it again.
I am really looking forward to that. I insist that you email me and let me know when you've got that book out.
I will. I will.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, and we will chat again soon.
I shall look forward to it. Is it time to say goodbye from Cardiff?
Yes.
Goodbye from Cardiff.
Goodbye from Florida.